Okay, so let's start talking about sections 3 and 4 of chapter 21. And this is once again continuing this idea of absolutism. Now, the sections 1, 2, and 5, we were looking at, Western Europe comparing the absolutism in Spain and France with the constitutionalism in the Dutch Republic and England. We switch over in these two sections to Central and Eastern Europe, and it's kind of a different animal there because we're going to see how absolutism and how political and social differences really contributed to a much kind of different scenario that was happening over in Central and Eastern Europe. So first, as a kind of quick reminder about absolutism from the last overview, it basically means that there's no legal limits on the power of the ruler. Remember, that is an important distinction. So there's no law that says the ruler can't do anything, but of course there's lots of things that restrict the ruler. There's technology, there's money, there's the power of the nobility, all those types of things. But at least in theory, the ruler can do anything he wants if he's absolute. It's also based on that idea of divine right. Many of these rulers claimed their authority to rule came directly from God. God had put their family, their dynasty in power, and that's why they had to be obeyed without question. And really, absolutism all over Europe, whether West or East, peaks in this period from the 1500s to the 1800s. It starts up with the end of the Renaissance and Reformation, and then really absolutism kind of fades away in most of Europe by the 1800s as the French Revolution and Napoleon's conquest kind of transform the political map of Europe. So we saw in the last section Western Europe, absolutism being practiced in Spain and France. In these two sections, we're going to talk about the examples of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, who were the three big powers of Central and Eastern Europe. And it's important to understand when you're thinking about the role of absolutism in Eastern Europe, how does Eastern Europe differ from what we just saw in the West? Well, one of the most important things is the Black Death. The Black Death has a devastating effect in Italy, in France, and England, massive population loss, and this really transforms a lot of those old medieval institutions like feudalism and the manor system. Well, the Black Death doesn't have quite as catastrophic an effect in Central and Eastern Europe. It hits areas of Germany and Poland and Russia, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was in Western Europe. So the population damage isn't as extensive. The serfs don't become more valuable because there are fewer laborers. A lot of those changes we saw in Western Europe don't happen. As a result, in Eastern Europe, the aristocracy remains very, very strong. And there's really a very tiny middle class. Because Eastern Europe and Central Europe, it's not as well positioned to take advantage of the new trade routes that have developed since the Renaissance. They're not going to be joining in on the age of discovery as much. The Germans and Polish don't plant any colonies in the Americas or in Africa and Asia. So there's no middle class that gets wealthy through trade to then become an effective balance against the aristocracy. And so serfdom continues to be very strong in Eastern and Central Europe, which means the nobility is very powerful, and rulers are going to have to really work much more closely with the nobility, often at the expense of the peasants, in order to achieve their goals. And this is something we'll see especially, for example, in Prussia. So just to kind of keep in mind some of those differences and how they play into this. So we start off in this overview by talking about Germany. Now, of course, there's actually no Germany yet. We just use that to refer to this collective number of hundreds of little states and principalities and church territories that have a common language and culture, but are politically disunited. And the big event in Germany that kind of starts the process going is the 30 Years' War. And this takes place from 1618 to 1648. So it's one of those wars that actually is the exact number of years that it's named for. And this is the continuation of the conflict that was happening in the Protestant Reformation. So the 30 Years' War begins with tensions between the Catholics and Protestants in the German states. And over the course of this war, as various nations and groups and people get involved, it's really devastating for Germany. In some areas of Germany, a third of the population is killed. And the war finally ends in 1648 when all of the sort of involved powers are just simply wiped out. They've spent enough money and soldiers. Nothing's really been gained. And it really brings to an end these explicitly religious wars. I mean, other wars will have religious overtones after this, but this is really the last war that starts off as strictly a conflict between competing religions, in this case Catholic and Protestant. France emerges as the big winner in the continent. It is much stronger, mainly because Germany is so much weaker. The other interesting thing about the Peace of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War is it introduces our sort of modern diplomatic system. In 1648, when the various powers send their representatives to Westphalia in Germany, it kind of starts this idea of nations negotiating and working together to, solve the problems that initially created a war in the first place. So after the 30 Years' War, their two dominant powers in Germany are Austria and Prussia. And Austria is still ruled by the old Habsburg family. We remember them from all the way back in chapter 17 with the Renaissance and Reformation. The Habsburgs have been in power for quite some time. Austria is really a tough area for this family to rule. The Habsburgs themselves are German, but their empire, the Austrian Empire, has a very diverse population. This is an area of Europe where there have been lots of migrations, lots of military battles back and forth, various groups fighting for control of the land. So it's a very ethnically and linguistically diverse population, and this makes it very hard to rule. But the Habsburgs do, conquer some new lands, and they build a much stronger army to enforce their will and create a bureaucracy to collect taxes and administer laws. But it's a challenge. And the biggest challenge is going to come in the early 1700s for Austria because the Austrian king dies without an heir, and his daughter, Maria Theresa, who you see over here, ends up taking power. And Maria Theresa has to face a lot of conflict with other rulers in Europe who think that she's going to be weak because she's a woman and try to take advantage of her, but she manages to hold her own and stay in power, and she really promotes Catholicism. She's a very strong supporter of the Catholic Church, and she really tries to weaken the power of the nobles and help the serfs in Austria, who had really been suffering up to this point in time. Now, Prussia is a very different story. Prussia doesn't have to deal with the kind of diversity that Austria has. Prussia also has a ruling family, the Hohenzollerns, who are in power. And Prussia is an area of Europe that's relatively flat. There's not a lot of natural obstacles. There's not a lot of valuable natural resources. It tends to be a land that armies march back and forth across and fight frequently. So kind of like if you think way back to Assyria when we did ancient history in Mesopotamia, the Prussians decided that the only way to really defend themselves and stop everyone from marching all over them is to build a really powerful army. And that's what they do. They build the strongest and most disciplined army in all of Europe. And under this guy here, Frederick the Great, Prussia really achieves its height of power. And remember, Frederick the Great from chapter 22 is a great proponent and supporter of Enlightenment ideas. But Frederick was also not afraid to use the great army that he inherited from his predecessors, and he really significantly increases the strength and wealth of the Prussian kingdom and builds a very powerful absolute monarchy, but an absolute monarchy tempered by those Enlightenment ideas that Frederick held so dear. So this is an illustration of a very interesting event that happens in May 23rd, 1618. It's the event that actually really kicks off the 30 Years' War, and it's just kind of an interesting thing to know. It's called the Defenestration of Prague. Prague is the main city, in this time period it was called Bohemia. Today we know it as the Czech Republic. And there was a lot of conflict in Bohemia because you had Catholic rulers, but the majority of the population was Protestant. And when the Catholic rulers of Bohemia tried to impose their Catholic beliefs, the nobles and officials in Bohemia got so upset that they literally threw the rulers' officials out the window of the castle in Prague. Now, the officials managed to survive mainly because they landed in the moat of the castle, but this event really kind of sparks a general rebellion that will then draw everyone into the larger war. And so this map here shows you kind of the European situation at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. And what you see is that here in Western Europe, you have well-defined nations with France, Spain, and England. They have evolved through the Middle Ages and become relatively unified. But in the East, if you go beyond France, you see that Europe is really kind of a mess. You have Austria, you have Prussia, and then you have all of these various smaller states. Italy is still divided up. You've got the Ottoman Empire down here in the southeast, which is a constant threat, and then you have Russia way over here in the east, which is just starting in the 1600s under Peter the Great to develop into a strong, powerful empire. So Europe, there's a lot of instability, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of tensions between the various states and powers, and that's going to be a driving force in a lot of what's going on during this time period. Okay, so when we talk about Austria and Prussia and really the rest of Europe, there are two wars that are really significant here. The first is the War of the Austrian Succession, and this starts when Maria Theresa takes over the throne of Austria. Frederick, up here in Prussia, thinks that he sees an advantage. He thinks that Maria Theresa will be weak, that he can grab some territory to strengthen Prussia. And so he invades this territory right here, Silesia, between Austria and Prussia. And Silesia has a lot of valuable natural resources. There's a lot of good farmland there. It's a really strategically significant chunk of geography. And you can see that it's kind of located right in between all of these various other territories. So it's a very important strategic area. Now, Maria Theresa manages to rally her people, particularly the nobility, to fight for her. She really becomes a very motivational and inspirational figure. She manages to hold off the Prussians. She loses Silesia to Prussia, but ultimately keeps the throne and manages to keep her empire united. So even though she loses territory, it's really a victory for her in that she keeps her throne. She's also helped out significantly by Great Britain over here, and if you'll notice that France and Prussia are allies, Britain and Austria are allies, so Britain and France will fight with each other during this time period. Now we move in this period between the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. In the 1750s, you have what's called this diplomatic revolution. So if you compare these two maps to each other, you'll notice that the alliances have all shifted here. So what happens is that Austria decides that France is no longer really its enemy. France and Austria had been bitter opponents ever since the 30 Years' War, but Maria Theresa and the rulers of Austria decide that, you know what, it's better to throw our lot in with France, because the real threat in Europe is now Prussia with its powerful army and under Frederick's rule. So Austria and France become allies, and Russia kind of joins in for the first time, taking an active role in European affairs and becomes ally with Austria and France as well. And now Prussia is kind of on its own, so Prussia goes to Great Britain and looks for help from Great Britain. And Great Britain is afraid that France and Austria together will be a big threat, so Great Britain and Prussia ally. So this diplomatic revolution is that everyone basically switched sides. So now instead of Austria and Great Britain fighting Prussia and France, now it's France and Austria fighting Prussia and Britain. And the 7 Years' War really doesn't do much in Europe. Very little territory changes despite the fighting and the loss of life. The real big impact of the 7 Years' War is in the conflict between France and Great Britain. That's the decisive factor, because we know this war in American history is the French and Indian War. Britain and France go to war with each other in North America and also in India, and Britain comes out the big winner. The one other major thing about the 7 Years' War to keep in mind is that both France and Britain are left with an enormous debt. It's a very expensive war. It's a war that spans the entire globe. It costs a huge amount of money, and France and Britain's effort to deal with that debt is going to be directly responsible for the American and French revolutions. Britain's effort to tax the colonists to pay for the debt of the 7 Years or French and Indian War is going to lead to the American Revolution, and then France's inability to pay their debt from the 7 Years' War, and then their debt from helping the Americans in the Revolutionary War is going to contribute to the collapse of the government in the French Revolution. So this war is really, really significant in terms of its long-term implications for Britain, France, and all of Europe. So if we switch over to this map here showing North America, you can see the very important effect that the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, has. You notice that in 1754, at the outset of the war, France controls this huge chunk of territory in the middle of North America, kind of dividing British Canada from the original 13 colonies. At the end of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, France is forced to cede all of that land to the British, so that now the British control of North America is totally complete, and it's basically Britain and Britain and Spain that control North America between the two of them, and this is going to contribute to a whole bunch of problems that will lead to the American Revolution. Okay, so moving forward in Section 4, we have to talk about Russia. And up to this point, Russia's been trying to, recover from its years and years of being ruled by the Mongols. So by the 1500s, Russia is still way behind the West in terms of science, technology, and commerce. And we touched on this in Chapter 11 when we talked about how Russia had fallen so far behind after the centuries of Mongol rule, and then in the 1400s, the rulers of Moscow were kind of struggling to unite the country and build their strength. So in the 1500s, Russian society is not only behind the West, but it's also kind of strictly and rigidly divided. You have the czars the rulers who have absolute authority. You have a powerful class of nobles known as the boyars, and the czars really depend on the boyars for their power, for their authority. And in exchange for the loyalty of the boyars, the czars basically grant the boyars complete control over their serfs. So serfdom is still a major issue in Russia, as it is also in Prussia, by the way. When we talked about Frederick the Great and the rulers of Prussia, they do a similar thing. They give the nobles more power over the serfs in exchange for the nobles' loyalty and obedience. Same thing happens here in Russia. Also, Russia has Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is another thing that separates it from the West and makes it very different. Now, the real story of Russia begins here with Peter the Great. And as you can see, Peter the Great takes power in the late 1600s, and he's determined to get Russia to catch up with the West and make it more powerful. And he begins this process by actually going and visiting the West. He goes on this, what's called a grand embassy, where he visits countries like England and the Netherlands. He learns about their technology, their political institutions. He brings this back with him to Russia and then launches a massive campaign of westernization. He tries to force the people of Russia, whether they like it or not, to adopt Western styles of dress, Western clothing, to read Western literature, to really act and think like people in the West. And he especially wants to utilize Western technology, all the benefits of science and commerce that have been building up in the West since the Renaissance. Peter forces the nobles to now work for the state, to become officers in the army and bureaucrats in his administration, and in return, he gives them more control over their serfs. Peter also realizes that the key to making Russia stronger is a modern army, so he brings officers from various countries in Europe to train his army so that it becomes up to the standards of a modern European army. And then finally, Peter knows that he needs to be able to trade and interact with Western nations, and that means he needs a city with a port, because up until this point in time, Russia doesn't really have a usable port that allows them to make contact with the West by sea. So after fighting a couple of battles against Sweden, Peter manages to gain some control over some territory on which he builds his new capital, St. Petersburg. And this gives him his famous quote-unquote window to the West that enables him to interact and trade and communicate more with the Western powers. So Peter the Great was really kind of a fascinating guy, and you can see these two distinct images of Peter the Great. This painting right here was done during his time in the Netherlands, during his great embassy when he was trying to learn about the technology and commerce in the West. And Peter would actually dress up in a common laborer's clothing and go down and work in the shipyards in the Netherlands and refuse to be referred to as a ruler so that he could really dig in and get to know the technology. And then, of course, years later, when Peter is ruling over his empire, it's very important to him to demonstrate his military prowess, and he's often painted in these depictions with armor and military gear to show his strength and greatness as he's trying to build up the Russian Empire. And so in this slide, you just see a couple of the interesting details. You see St. Petersburg right here on the Gulf of Finland. This was the key sort of port that Peter wanted to facilitate his ability to communicate with the West. And that just is kind of an interesting addition here. You know, Peter really took this idea of westernization to the extreme, even to the point of forcing the Russian nobles to wear Western clothing and to cut their beards. It was very fashionable in Russia to have these very long and thick beards, and Peter actually stationed officials at the gates of cities in Russia to cut the beards off the nobles to force them to look more Western. And this was all part of his plan to, westernize Russia. And his policies are very successful. Russia really, by leaps and bounds, becomes a very strong and powerful nation that's able to take a very active role in European affairs.